speaker of the day, Dr. Sharda Narayananji, Professor Sharda Narayananji. She is a professor in a department which is dedicated for Natya Shastra in Chennai, and she has worked on Abhinava Gupta. She has a great command over Vakyapadiyam and Alankara Shastra. On the traditional side, she has a great command over many traditional texts. And because of her exposure to modern scholarship, she has seen how distortions of our Alankara Shastra material and material on our Sanskrit literature is happening from the Indological side also. And she has experience in countering also. Raju Malhotra ji organized the Swadeshi Indology conference, and then she was presenting her counter arguments there in Swadeshi Indology conference also. And in her earlier talks on Indica platform also, she was very well powerfully and effectively countering the distortions and misinterpretations by the Indologists. So now she is going to present her counter arguments to the misinterpretations and distortions by Indologists regarding Sanskrit literature and poetics. Over to you, Sharda ji.
Thank you very much, sir. Namaskar to everyone. For me, it is a great privilege to be on this platform with Indica. And the Indica symposiums have a way of selecting very relevant and innovative themes. So I must thank Professor Paturi ji and Shrinidhi ji for all their support and encouragement. So in my, what I have prepared, I would like to look at three aspects, three issues. First is issues on Ramayana and issues on vernacular languages as being suppressed by Sanskrit, and issues on rasa theory. These are from the American Indology point of view, chiefly represented by Sheldon Pollock. That is what I have read. And my examples and the points that I am bringing up here are based on two books that I have had occasion to read in detail. The Battle for Sanskrit of Rajiv Malhotra, published in 2016. We are doing a part of a translation project, translating this book into Sanskrit itself. And I have been a part of that. And in the same year, 2016, in fact, the Rasa Reader has also come out, published by Columbia University Press and written by Sheldon Pollock. Some years ago, I had written a paper to counter some of the views of Rasa Reader. And over the years, I find when we look at a work like that, it is so easy for us to counter from the Shastriya point of view. So we look at the issues on Ramayana. And here, Sheldon Pollock has a very novel picture of the development of Sanskrit literature itself. He claims that the Vedic scholars had no imagination or pratibha or creativity or independent thinking. They were used to repeating the superstitious ideas of the Vedas. So they were not capable of any original thinking. And it was the Buddhists who first created kavya and literature meant for secular purpose. That is the whole idea of literature for a normal reader away from the Vedic context. And it was after seeing the Buddhists using the language to create kavya that the Vedic stream, that is the Brahmins or the Sanskrit scholars, also learned to create kavya. So this is an elaborate picture that he paints. He also says that the Ramayana itself is based on the Buddha's life and Buddhist literature. Now, he says all this and he presents a very detailed picture, but there are certain facts that contradict this from our traditional erudition. When we look at the internal evidence, whether it is Natya Shastra or even earlier from the Nirukta or Panini Ashtadhyayi or Chanda Shastra, we can see that the foundations of Sanskrit literature was there well before the Buddhist time. But Pollock ignores these things and presents a completely different and very novel view of the history of Sanskrit literature itself. Some of the issues he focuses on, there are many, and I would have a lot of very tedious quotations, because unless we go over the quotations, we are not able to see what they are trying to say. One of his theories is the divinization of kings. He says the divinization of the king is a Vedic process by which a human is magically infused with powerful divine qualities. And once divinized in this way, the king becomes authoritarian and despotic. In the Ramayana, divinization is used to infuse divine qualities into Rama, who is then able to overcome great odds and win victories that would be impossible for mere mortals to achieve. The source of this principle of divinization, Pollock claims, is the Vedas. So it is the coronation and the Vedic mantras that are supposed to create this extra power within the individual. Basically, he has to blame the Vedas and the Brahmins for enforcing this kind of a view and the hegemony into society. But it is interesting in this particular example where in the Ramayana, Rama was actually denied this Vedic coronation. For most of his time, when he went about achieving those extraordinary superhuman achievements, he did not have the benefit of this coronation mantras. So this is a basic fact that contradicts what Pollock says. Another very detailed point he makes, which looks a little surprising to a reader like myself, where we are not looking for any very strong traditional view or opposing, and we are quite open to the ideas. But the idea of the lack of free will that he portrays came as a surprise to me. He says another important aspect of Pollock's framework is that he considers the major characters in the Ramayana lacking in free will. In other words, they are bound to act fatalistically. He alleges that the epic was used by Hindu kings to suppress their subjects and marginalize women, excluding them from power. In this respect, he says, Rama is depicted as completely obedient and subservient to Dasharatha, and as such is an example of fatalistic thinking for Hindus. Kaikeyi is shown as cunning and manipulative for attempting to exercise her free will in her dealings with her husband, Dasharatha, while Kausalya and Sita are portrayed as exemplars of blind subservience to husbands, even when they are wrong. So it is a favorite theme to show that women are subjugated and the only virtuous women are those who are completely obedient. And there is a constant fascination with fatalism and dharma and karma and punarjanma that appears again and again. We will see even in my presentation in further examples. Now, to say that Rama had no free will, further he says nobody had any free will. But at every point, we see Rama being able to explain why he takes a particular stand. The most important event when he is exiled and he leaves on the eve of his Yuvaraja coronation itself, Lakshmana, who at every point in the Ramayana shows knowledge of polity and the duty of a prince or a king, and he suggests the course. He says, you fight for your rights. You are the eldest brother and it is your right. And please don't accept this decision that Kaikeyi is suggesting. And I will support you and you can fight for your right. But Rama does not take that option. Again, Bharata himself comes and says, no, you must not go, you must come back. Again, he does not take that. So it does not appear that Rama was going along against his will or forced into it. So when we look at the definition of will that Pollock analyzes, that itself is fundamentally different. Pollock ignores that the king was expected to rule by consulting the council of ministers and that all decisions were to be in accordance with Dharmashastras. He foists the divine right of kings to rule, which is actually a feature of European ruling class. He portrays it as a Vedic evil. And when we analyze, whenever they show free will, if they do something that gives them pleasure, that they enjoy, then he calls it will. But if they choose to do something because they believe it is the right thing to do, he says they are forced into it. So when we analyze all the references that Pollock says about free will, actually there is a difference in the fundamental definition of will itself. According to Pollock, such a divine king does not have to abide by the rules of Dharmashastras because those apply only to mortal rulers. How he comes up with a statement like this with no backing, no support, it is totally a baseless allegation that such a divine king, if he is coronated with the Vedic mantras, which every king was, so he is not a mortal king and he does not have to follow Dharmashastras. Where can Pollock get such a observation from? Every subject of a divine king has to follow his wishes and commands as absolutes. Therefore, the divinization of a king in the Vedic tradition makes him a despot. Pollock's textual evidence for reading Valmiki's Rama in the negative light he does consists simply of quoting one verse uttered by Rama. That verse is here. He says, Durlabhasya cha dharmasya jivitasya shubhasya cha rajano vanarashreshta pradataro na samshayaha. Tanna himsyat na chakroshet nakshipet napriyam vadet deva manusha rupena charantyete mahitale. So he says that the king is to be respected and the king is the ultimate caregiver, and therefore he should never be thwarted and should always be supported. Now, using this verse, he says that they become despots. Now, again, this free will issue, Pollock says that nobody has any free will in the Ramayana. One of Pollock's fundamental views is that all the important sacred figures of the tradition lack individuality and free will. He holds that Rama's feelings are quite irrelevant to the poem's purposes. Indeed, he says, we cannot know what any of the characters in the Ramayana feels or why they choose to do something because no one in the Ramayana believes himself or herself to have any freedom of action. In general, he sees the characters in Valmiki's Ramayana as lacking agency and freedom of choice and therefore having no control over what happens to them. This acceptance of suffering means there is no justice. So he writes a lot of descriptive things, but actually we find that it has no basis and it presents a picture quite original and created by Pollock. The characters of the Ramayana believe themselves to be denied all freedom of choice. How Pollock alleges this, what examples? There are no examples and there are no quotations in his writing style. What happens to them may be the result of their own doing, but they do not understand how this is so and consequently can exercise no control. The fate Rama and others is prepared for them at some plane beyond their intervention or even comprehension. Justice never enters the picture. So justice is a concept that Pollock chooses and imposes on the situation. Even worse, he contrasts this with the ancient Greek system, because the ancient Greek system also had many gods and they intervened in the human lives. There was retribution, there was revenge, there were jealousies. But it is really absurd to make these kind of comparisons that Pollock does with confidence, because in our religion, we have a concept of all the gods merging into one, of being different aspects of one supreme power that operates in various ways. And the Greek system does not have this concept. The gods are eternally separate. They are individuals in their own right. They have their jealousies, they have their rivalries, and they do intervene in man's life. But there is no overall logic that can unite that system. So how can Pollock say, since in the archaic Greek world, fate has both a cosmic dimension and an aspect of justice? The gods can guarantee the whole process as guardians of a just and moral order. Significantly, gods play no role whatever in Ayodhya. There is a mechanical quality to the course of human affairs. If we can accept that the Greek system has a cosmic dimension and an aspect of justice, in what way is it lacking in the Indian system of various gods? And how can you say there is a mechanical quality to the course of human affairs? Basically, this is a view that the American Indologists want to impose on the Indian thought system. They have a fascination for this fatalism and the mechanical quality and karma. They don't understand the śāstric logic behind these concepts. And constantly there is a statement of the Indian thought being pre-modern or belonging to a earlier era where the ideas are not relevant anymore. When he says gods play no role, he is ignoring Valmiki's own testimony that the rishis appealed to Vishnu about being oppressed by the Rakshasas. That is from the Battle for Sanskrit. I have an example here of how Pollock's writing, rarely does he quote the Sanskrit verse. I have put the verse here myself. His style of writing will be elaborate interpretation and conveying what he thinks the reader should understand. He will give his picture and there will be no examples and there will be no original text to quote. Here is the famous, probably the most famous verse from Manuda Smriti, which is usually quoted to show that the whole thing oppresses women. So Pollock's translation is here that I have quoted that. He says, in childhood, a woman must bow to the will of her father, in adulthood to the will of the man who marries her, and when her husband is dead, to the will of her sons. She must never have independence. So we here see how he says that must bow to the will of her father. These are extra words that Pollock has put in. The whole verse, it only says Pita Rakshati Kaumare. Rakshati, this whole verse that talks of protection, has been misconstrued or portrayed as something that suppresses women. Professor K.T. Pandurangiji had written in detail about this verse when he talks of human values from the Smritis. He says this is, of course, very frequently misunderstood. Firstly, this verse appears in the section of economic arrangements. So we have to understand it in that context. It only means that the woman should not be forced to earn her livelihood. There should be somebody in the family to protect her. Those were days when they did not have a PAN card or a bank account of every individual. So it was a family wealth and the family property. So it says that she has to be taken care of because there are other obligations that she fulfills. The word swatantriyam is invariably taken as she must never have independence or freedom, but it actually means self-sustenance or any kind of a strategy to sustain herself. So it is not freedom or it is not that, but that is an example of how Pollock has included many words to present his own translation. The second issue, when we go to issues on kavya and vernaculars, one of Pollock's views is that the earlier Vedic language and the Vedic Sanskrit and the Vedic culture was very dogmatic and very superstitious and primitive. He uses the words primitive. And there was no independent use of language. But after seeing the Buddhists create literature, Sanskrit was also used for literature. But he ignores the spiritual or moral or even the aesthetic aspects of literature. And he looks at it as purely as a political tool. He says Sanskrit kavya was meant to propagate the king's power. The royalty supported the priesthood for creating kavya, and the kavya created by the priesthood glorified the king's power, and this maintained the hegemony and the equation in society. This is the main value of kavya that Pollock says. He says that while Sanskrit kavya appeared with Valmiki's Ramayana in the 2nd century BCE, this is again his own date, the tradition lacked a developed theory of kavya until the 17th century CE, which is about 900 years later or even more. He writes, Sanskrit literary, 1900 years, I think, I'm sorry about that. He says, Sanskrit literary theory is a tardy development, remarkably tardy. What does the sentence mean? I think it means zero. There is nothing that it can mean, except it shows his attitude, his bias, which he wants to instill into the reader. Tardy is a relative term. So what is he comparing it with? In our Shastras, whatever little I can understand, we have to define whatever we are saying. When we use something as a yardstick, the yardstick is always defined. Here, tardy is compared to Indian development compared to other countries, or is it over time? What does he mean? So he does not care to explain, but no holds barred on giving a lot of opinion. It belies the fact that The Natya Shastra itself has so much detail about the structure of literature and the various aspects. And it is probably the first work in the whole world that addresses these issues. But Pollock just ignores those things. Now, the relation between Sanskrit and Prakrit is not understood. He talks of Prakrit as a completely different language to Sanskrit. He says that, in fact, it was because the Buddhists used Pali and Prakrit in opposition to Sanskrit that the importance of Sanskrit reduced. And the whole notion, the whole picture painted is as if Prakrit is one language and Sanskrit is another, and they were in competition. They were rivaling each other. But the fact is, even from very early references, we can see that Sanskrit and Prakrit Kavya developed together. They were organically related languages. And in the modern world, we can compare it to the standardized Hindi that might be used over a wider area, to the bhasha or the spoken dialects in every region. Or even in Tamil, the way we speak Tamil and the way we write Tamil is very different. For example, we may say, Avam varan, but while writing, they say, Avargal varugirar. So there is a lot of difference between the casual colloquial way and the way that the same words are put into written form. We see in chapter 15 of the Natya Shastra, they talk of dialogue and the Vachika Abhinaya beginning, the dialogues and the lines used in drama. So it says, Dvividam hi smritam pathyam. Pathyam is the dialogue or whatever is spoken or sung in the play, the dialogues. Dvividam hi smritam pathyam samskritam prakritam tatha. Tayor vibhagam vakshyami yathavat anupurvashaha. So Bharata Muni says that I will explain Sanskritam and Prakritam Patyam. Patyam is again the lyrics and the dialogues. And he goes on to explain the Sanskritam Patyam first. Then 3 chapters later, he says, as I told you, I will explain Prakritam. So in chapter 18, he begins, Evam tu Sanskritam Patyam maya proktam dvijottamaha. Prakritasya tu pathyasya sampravakshyami lakshanam. So I have discussed the Sanskrit dialogues. Now let us look at the Prakrit aspect. Etadeva viparyastam samskara gunavarjitam vigneyam prakritam pathyam nanavasthantar atmakam. He says the same thing, contradictory to the Sanskritam that we have analyzed so far. The Prakritam Pathyam lacks the grammatical refinements. It lacks the precision and the formal formations. And Nana Vasthantar Atmakam. And the Prakrit is of many kinds. It has many forms and many aspects going by different places. Nana Avasthantar Atmakam. It has many aspects, many forms. Obviously not in the same place. So Prakrit is not one language. And they even give the names of the Prakrit styles used in different regions. And how is Prakrit fundamentally different to Sanskrit? Trividam tacha vigneyam natya yoge samasataha. In brief, when we include Prakrit in Natya, in the dialogues, there are 3 ways in which Prakrit is different to Sanskrit. That is Samana Shabdam, Vibhrashtam, and Deshigatam Athapicha. He says Samana Shabdam. So the same words as in Sanskrit are used. Vibhrashtam, corrupted forms, or Tadbhava, Tatsama, we say, slightly phonetically changed forms. And then Deshi Gatam Athapicha. Then they could be local usages that is found in that particular region. So it belongs to the vernacular language totally. So all these 3 aspects together constitute the Prakrit language. Writers like Pollock glorify the Buddha for choosing Pali and Prakrit over Sanskrit in public address. Pali was not one language, it changed over time. Prakrit is not one language. And it is also interesting, right from school, we have been told that they preferred Pali and Prakrit over Sanskrit. But we need to see historically if people actually used Sanskrit in very large public addresses. Natya being one of the best forms of public address or public discourse that is meant for all sections of society, always included Sanskrit and Prakrit. So it is unlikely that public announcements made by the king or public addresses by any dignitaries or religious leaders would have constituted of pure Sanskrit. So to say that the Buddha used Pali and Prakrit itself is a Probably a redundant observation, because that must have been the normal state of public addresses everywhere. So Pollock uses Sanskrit Kavya as a political tool for royal power. He says that the literary culture was established by Kavya, and Kavya was above all a component, and perhaps the supreme component of royal competence and distinction, of royal pleasure and civility. As an example, he notes that the Ramayana was recited before the hero of the tale, and in this moment, much that characterizes the entire history of the culture is encapsulated. The location of the performance is the royal court, whose fortunes were by and large the fortunes of the Kavya. What he says is that the Adi Kavya itself illustrates what he calls the tendency of Kavya to establish the supremacy of the king, the divinization of the king, and how everybody should obey that. And he says that when the Ramayana was recited in the court by Lava and Kusha, when they sang the Ramayana before the king, the fortunes of the Ramayana itself was made. Naturally, it became the most popular kavya and it became propagated always. What he fails to mention is that when we read the Ramayana, we find that it was not written, sponsored by the court and written in the court. Valmiki wrote it in the ashram in the forest. He trained these two bards, Lava and Kusha, who were excellent singers. And it was so moving that he talks about their fine voice and their musical melody and the trained voice, the saptaswaras that had perfect place in the way they sang. And it became so popular. People loved it. They sang it in the ashrams, and the other rishis and munis, they gave them simple gifts like water pots or cloth or a bark garment, the rough garments that they use in the forest. Or they gave them their blessing. They had nothing else to give, they gave them their blessing. And how it became more and more popular, and how they sang it at the village crossroads, in the highways. And slowly it became so famous that they were invited to the court to present it. This Pollock ignores. And in fact, the story of the Adi Kavya is the story of Kavya, except Pollock misrepresents the whole thing. Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit. He has an elaborate theory of how Sanskrit suppressed other vernacular languages, and it was only much later, after the foreign invasions, that the local languages were able to come to their own. He speaks of Pali and Prakrit being preferred by the Buddhists as a reason for the development of vernacular languages. But we must see that Pali and Prakrit were at no time a single language. Prakrits were local and changed from region to region. So was Pali also, which changed over time. And the Buddhists themselves switched to Sanskrit for their śāstric discourse. And most people were bilingual, if not multilingual. This is an aspect that foreign scholars do not realize, and they are not able to feel the truth of that, where within India, we are able to switch very easily between languages. The third aspect is when we look at some of the aspects from the Rasa Reader, published way back in 2016. When you see a Rasa Reader, you expect it to represent the tradition. Way back in 2016, there was a book review towards the end of the year by a professor of English from Pondicherry University. The review was full of praise. One of the things he said was that the writer overflows with rasa so that it comes into his work. Now, I feel that the average Indian person may require a PhD in English to be able to read Pollock's book. It is very tedious and very depressing. But whether he understands the issues, and whether an English professor who may not be trained in the Sanskrit Sahitya tradition is in a position to really judge is a big question. We look at a few issues. This is a very tedious quotation where Pollock says that although we had so many Shilpa Kalas and Shilpa Shastras and painting and sculpture, we had no concept of art. He talks of including sculpture, which is pusta. Pusta is not sculpture. Pusta is what the Fevicol advertises. It is all, in Aharya Abhinaya, pusta is used. Light things put together with glue and cloth and stuffings so that they are like some props. It is not sculpture, which is Shilpa Shastra. So he says that we had no concept of art and we had no pure art. So he says this in detail, and he says that we didn't have any aesthetic analysis of beauty in nature or art, including nature. Though Shiva was a dancer, God in India was generally not an artist. So that is what he says. Then this, he says, as for questions of creativity and genius, Pratibha, Indian thinkers certainly were interested in them, but they never thought it necessary to develop a robust theory to account for their nature or impact on the work. Interpretation was never thematized as a discrete problem of knowledge in literary texts. Critical judgments were certainly rendered, but literary evaluation itself was not framed as a philosophical problem. Last, while careful attention was directed to beauty or saundarya, especially in literature, which does have a role to play in aesthetic reflection, beauty was typically disaggregated, never became an object of abstract consideration in and out of itself. Now, when he talks of abstract consideration of art, who talks of abstract consideration of art? In fact, it is only the Indian theory that has actually made the whole issue abstract, of understanding why and how the art experience actually happens. And when it is actually analyzed compared to real cognition, the cognitive sciences and the artistic experience, they are very clearly defined and explained. The modern subject of aesthetics began only in the 18th century. It was in the 1700s, with Baumgarten first using the word aesthetic to mean sense perception. Slowly, it became part of philosophy in general to study art. It was not until then that these questions were addressed. Some of the questions that modern aesthetics addresses is what makes beautiful objects to attract people? Why do people enjoy beautiful art? What emotional or spiritual benefit do people gain from artistic enjoyment? What are the techniques of achieving the right aesthetics in any specific field? When we look at the techniques, then we have to look at any specific art. But the earlier three questions, which are more abstract and generalized, have been actually addressed in our ancient texts. But Pollock does not use that. And Baumgarten and Immanuel Kant were German writers who wrote in Latin in the 1700s. And it is only after their work that aesthetics has come into its own as a separate subject. So how can Pollock say that we didn't have a concept of art or any abstract art? Which country had an abstract art? There was no art in any part of the world that was not here in India. So it is difficult to really find a basis for whatever Pollock says, except that he writes in a very descriptive and very picturesque manner. When we look at the Rasa Sutra, you would expect the Rasa reader to explain the Rasa Sutra very clearly. It does not do that. Pollock is unable to explain Vibhava or Anubhava or Vyavichari Bhava. And of course, the Rasa experience also. He talks of Vibhavas and others as factors. See, Vibhavas are translated as determinants by good translators like Adi Rangacharya and many others, where the Vibhava Visheshena Bhavayati or Visheshataya Vijnapayati, V is always used for a specialized meaning. So when you see a stage and the curtain goes up and the show is yet to begin, we are full of anticipation. But we don't know if there is going to be a comedy scene coming up or any pathos or humor. We don't know what is going to be depicted. If a young couple come smiling at each other, looking bashful, we know, okay, maybe there is a love scene that is going to come up. We become prepared to receive that. So the determinants, the vibhavas, are the basic characters and the props that tell the emotions which way, which mood to move towards, to proceed on. And when that sthayi bhava or that basic mood reaches a very high degree, we call it the rasa experience. But Pollock does not explain vibhava. There are a lot of problems in the way he explains this, anubhava, etc. And for sthayi bhavas, he says, why does Bharata count only 8 sthayi bhavas? There are so many emotions. In the Natya Shastra, Bharata himself says that Ashtau rasa natye smritaha. He is only concerned about how much can be dramatized. The Rasa Sutra, Vibhava Anubhava, Vyavichari Samyogat, Rasa Nishpattihi, is not explained by Pollock. I don't want to go into detail explaining the Rasa theory itself. It will take a long time. When we come to Kavya, we know that in our tradition, we tell us there is Prekshya Kavya and Shravya Kavya. Prekshya is the drama that is to be seen and enjoyed and performed, and Shravya is literature that is only recited and heard. But Pollock talks of rasa seen and rasa heard. There is a whole paper where he takes this very seriously. He says rasa is aesthetic emotional relish, whereby beauty is savored. But Pollock keeps using the word taste, though there are much better words otherwise. He says in Prekshya Kavya, rasa is seen, and in Shravya Kavya, rasa is heard. This is without basis. It is not what the tradition says. Rasanubhava and rasaswada correspond to rasa experience and not taste. Pollock wrongly translates pratyaksha kalpa samvedana, quoting from Abhinava Bharati, as visual perception. Now, pratyaksha kalpa samvedana is not visual perception. The word visual is not warranted. Perception includes all the senses, and here Abhinava Gupta is clearly speaking of literature leading to rasa experience when the reader is able to imagine the situation as if real, not seeing it as a picture. The account of rasa seen in drama discounts the effect of music, rhythm, pauses, etc. The chapter 6 in Natya Shastra speaks of rasa experience. It says, Bhavabhinaya sambandhan sthai bhavans tata buddhaha aswadayanti manasa tasmat natya rasaha smrita. So the Natya Shastra says that it is savored by the mind. So we cannot pin it down to what is seen and what is heard. Like connoisseurs who relish variety in food. There are two examples that Bharata takes pains to give as a parallel of how the rasa experience is created in the performance. He says, just as connoisseurs of tasty food, who are very gourmets, they are very particular gourmands, they are very particular about various tastes. And our Indian meal has a combination of spices, tanginess, lemon juice, tamarind, chili, spice, all these tastes, how they enjoy and relish. Like that in drama, they enjoy various bhavas being presented. And he gives the example of the panaka or the lemonade, where he says we put the lemon and we put the elaichi and the jaggery, and how the taste of the panaka is not the taste of any one of the ingredients. It is created as a unique combination of all these things. So these are the two examples that Bharata gives in the Natya Shastra to explain how the rasa experience is created. But Pollock says, from such an analytical perspective, he is looking at the Rasa Sutra. The play looks like a jumble of disconnected components. They are ultimately combined into a whole, where each component is at once preserved and subsumed. So he gives no effort to explain the whole rasa theory or the idea, but he quickly calls it pre-modern and belonging to an ancient world. This is like, when blue cheese is considered a great, very delicacy. Can we call it a jumble of casein, fungus, and maggots? Some cheeses are supposed to have worms in them also. So this is the extent to which he takes the effort of explaining what it is. And without explaining what the tradition means by these definitions, there is a lot of opinion that he presents. Pollock says that Natya Shastra speaks of rasa in the character, not in the spectator, and is hence not a theoretical discussion of aesthetics in the abstract sense. This is untenable because the word prekshakaha is right there. The rasa experience is not for the actors, it is not for the performing group, but for the audience, for the spectators. They're very clear about that. Nana bhava abhinaya vyanjitan sthai bhavan aswadayanti sumanasaha prekshakaha harshadimscha adhigachanti. The spectators enjoy this and they reach a state of delight. So it is definitely an aesthetic theory. No two ways about that. The samskara is the memory impressions. And when we look at Shastra, every Shastra that deals with samskara will explain what they mean by that. But many Indologists and Western Indologists may like to take a popular meaning, what these words are used in colloquial language today in modern India, where many of Indians, we ourselves are not very well informed on what the Shastra point is. And then they interpret the Shastras based on the meaning that they gain from the popular usage. But these are favorites. Samskara, vasana, punarjanma, transmigration. These are favorites to call us pre-modern. So he talks of samskara is the mention of memory of past lives. See, when we talk of the rasa theory, we talk of cognition, pramanas, we can show the importance of samskara within this life itself. We don't need to go to previous life. It is a logical extension when the question comes up as to where does pratibha come, where does some things come. Then they say maybe from the previous birth. The point is that it is inborn and not acquired. That is the main point. But Pollock makes much of the mention of memory of past lives and pretends not to see the main point, calling rasa contingent on past lives. He says there is no doubt a good answer to the obvious question, why the endless cycle of transmigration would not eventually endow all people with all predispositions, but our thinkers do not provide it. The Shastras all talk about this. You look at the endless cycle, the karma theory, we know where each propensity or any particular result would begin. But he chooses not to see that. Pollock makes rasa contingent on transmigration. This is the ultimate problem. After writing a big book on rasa reader, he is informing his readership that the concept of rasa is contingent on transmigration and as belonging to a pre-modern world. To understand rasa as a historical form of thought, however, as I try to enable the reader of this reader to do, is to confront a theory clearly contingent on a non-modern worldview and understanding of literary art. Its full conceptualization is intimately tied to a number of primary, uncontested, and largely non-transferable Indian presuppositions about the threefold psychophysiology of Sankhya, for example, or the storage of memories of past lives, or even transmigration. It would be very long to discuss these things and to bring up the Shastra objection. It is clearly possible. We look at the subheadings of chapter 1 of a rasa reader, the basis of rasa theory in drama, rasa as a figure of speech in narrative poetry, the early views, rasa as a figure of speech, the late view, rasa as the character's emotion and how we know it. There are no rules for the number of rasas. Rasa cannot be expressed or implied, only manifested. Rasa cannot be a figure of speech. It is what figures of speech ornament, and there can be no manifestation of rasa. So if we look at these subheadings themselves, you can see the contradiction, which is what he brings out. He says that the ideas were overturned. They are not able to make up their mind. These kind of observations pepper his discussion. And there are no rules for the number of rasas. In that section, he deals with how there are 8 and then there is a 9th rasa, that is Shanta rasa. And then he talks of Bhakti rasa and he complains how in the 15th century, the Bhakti Rasa Amrita Sindhu, that by Jiva Goswami, that book, he says, he complains, he says, why is rasa aesthetic experience used for bhakti? See, when the society is using it and explaining and the experience, and much earlier, it's very clearly established between real cognitions and the artistic cognition or the art experience, are alaukika is very clearly explained. And within the alaukika experience, the bhakti, the satsangs, when the whole ambience is created where the bhakta merges into bhakti, is discussed. But Pollock says that this is not aesthetic, and why is it discussed here? And so there are no rules for the number of rasas. Whenever a writer conforms to earlier writing, Pollock explicitly says that he has nothing to add. And whenever a writer has some innovative discussion, he says he is disputing the theory because the theory is not sound. So this he does frequently. When we have artistic discussions, there should be creative freedom. There should be respect for different points of view. But that is not the way Pollock presents the subject. This is another important point, and I'm close to finishing this. When we look at mundane and super mundane, laukika and alaukika, he is not able to explain this. For the savoring of rasa or rapture, as he calls it, Abhinava reserves the qualification supermundane, that is beyond loka, alaukika. But even this assessment and much of the understanding of literature that accompanied it was to be overturned in the coming centuries. There are a few writers who differ and say that all rasas are not pleasurable, they are not ananda, but that is minority. Most writers have gone along with the way Abhinavagupta has presented it. But here too, disagreement among later commentators, including one in the 16th century, who boldly rejects Mamata's position, shows the growing inadequacy of such an appraisal. So these are the observations when there is creative thinking and there is a lot of innovation in the way these are presented. These are the way that he comments. And the long and short of it is he is simply unable to explain Alaukika. There is no comment he makes on explaining this to his readers. He says theory is related, however obscurely, to practice, and the history of rasa theory roughly maps against the history of practice of Sanskrit literature, understanding literature in the sense accorded to the category in Sanskrit culture itself. In that sense, Sanskrit literature was an invention of the beginning of the common era. In an earlier quote, he talks of the normativity of Sanskrit literature that poets had to follow. If something so creative and artistic developed as a structure of Sanskrit literature, and over time, these have been analyzed and recorded in starting with Nati Shastra and all the Sahitya texts. It is not as if a normativity is imposed on literature. So this is a fundamental mistake that a lot of Western scholars do. They take our descriptive Shastras as prescriptive Shastras. They are unable to see that theory and practice go together. Practice comes first and then the theory. They are unable to see that point because our tradition is so ancient. They quickly surmise that the prescriptions have come and it becomes very dogmatic and oppressive. And I just conclude with Yaska's quotation from the Nirukta. He says that it is not the pillar's fault if the blind man does not see it, and he goes and bangs on it. He says, Naisha sthanor aparadho yadena mandho na pashyati purusha aparadaha sabhavati. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And this is all that I have prepared for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharda ji. It was very well organized. Every slide had the Purva Paksha and your counter, very well argued with very good evidences and arguments. I'm sure your talk was very well received because
Thank
it was very well audible and very well presented in a very organized way.